attention to the destruction of the 3 World Trade Center towers in New York City on September 11th, 2001, and a whole lot more. This is 9/11 Freefall. Hi everyone, this is Andy Steele. I'm back again for another show. I'm always happy for the privilege of being able to do this show and be able to talk to so many interesting and amazing people. And this week will be no exception. Adam Taylor is back, and he's going to talk about his latest paper that explores past building collapses and how they do not match up to the destruction of the Twin Towers and Building 7. And that's, of course, because those buildings I just mentioned were destroyed by controlled demolition. That fact rings true regardless of whether or not it makes you feel good or whether you want to believe the country music songs about why we need to attack the world to avenge the lie. America is fearfully running from the truth, so that is why this show exists. We talk about 9/11 truth, particularly the science of 9/11 truth, and I bring you people like the guest today who are not afraid of it. We're helping hold the flag in place so that criminal elements of our government and its lie machine media can't entirely run off with it and claim it for their own. And we are winning. We are winning because of the simple fact that we are gaining ground all the time. We are not moving on to the latest distraction. We are not engaging in the polite, meaningless chit-chat of Republican versus Democrat or rationalizing away the continuing erosion of our Constitution. No, we're getting our hands dirty and we're cutting through the nervous smiles of onlookers who don't want to go there. We're upsetting the plans of gatekeepers in the media who only care about being famous or pushing some partisan plan to impose their will on everybody else. All right, this isn't politics. This is 9/11 reality. The reality of a crime that killed thousands of people and which is the anchor holding back the free destiny of our country. All right, if you're out there in the choir and you're already aware of the controlled demolition evidence and you're speaking out about it, don't let people say that you're into talking about politics. All right? No, you're not one of those phonies on TV with their trendy black rimmed glasses gloating about how easy it is to manipulate people. All right? You're not some jerk in a barbershop quartet hat caucusing or some pencil neck intern at a senator's office signing bills with an electric pen. All right? You're an American citizen who knows we have a major problem here and who has risen to the challenge of his time even while those around him sink like boulders into a sea of decadence. We are the ghostly beating heart under the floorboards that drives the murderer mad. We are the conscience of a nation that whispers truth while it dreams. And what makes the bad guys angry is that they know their jig is up. And of course, the group responsible for much of this awakening is architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. And I talk about this organization every week on this show. I am a volunteer for it, and although the show speaks for itself, I am more than happy to spread the word about it everywhere I go. All right, if you haven't seen Blueprint for Truth or 9/11 Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out yet, then pause this broadcast right now and do a YouTube search for either one of them and watch them. All right, watch the evidence laid out for you. Speak about the evidence to everyone you know. All right, buy copies of the movies at ae911truth.org and hand them out to people at your next 4th of July event or outside your local mall. Do whatever you can to wake up the people of America before it's too late. And another way of doing that is to volunteer. And I can't say that enough, folks. It's about getting organized and being part of a team that you can lend your talents to. Together, stronger groups of people are unbreakable. And you don't have to feel alone just because you may live somewhere where the flickery blue box is more of a toehold and the big lie is more ingrained in people's minds. All right, thanks to modern technology, smart, unafraid people can connect with each other like never before, and they can form the bonds they need to throw a net over the real perpetrators of the 9/11 crime. All right, if you volunteer at ae911truth.org, you do that by going to the volunteer tab on the right-hand side of the screen. You just fill out some boxes, and that's it. Somebody will get back in touch with you, and you'll be on your way. And folks, let me tell you, it's more fun telling the truth than being one of these grinning phonies pretending to either not know about the controlled demolition evidence or not caring about it. All right, even if you don't have a lot of time to spread the word, just knowing the reality of the situation is liberating enough. If for no other reason, then it separates you from these people who think they run things in America. And you know what I'm talking about. Gerald Celente, the pundit who appears on many alternative news radio shows, he calls them the people you couldn't stand in high school. All right, the suck-ups, the brown-nosers. And I played those clips of people in Congress and certain pundits being asked about the 9/11 controlled demolition evidence last week. And I got a video of it up at 911freefall.com. And you watch this video and you see what a bunch of uninformed, useless people these supposed representatives are. I'm sorry, I'm just telling it like I see it. And I'm not a particularly religious person, but I do understand the liberation felt by a message that says you don't need validation from anyone other than yourself and your God if you believe in one. That's because that's the truth. You don't need a title. You don't need $1 million or everybody knowing your name. You just need to be alive, enjoy your time here, and stand for something while you're on this planet. And being awake to what really happened on 9/11 really drives that point home, because you become instantly aware that your government, all right, the self-appointed God of our land here, is really just a collective of inept opportunists at their best. And really that the only people who make anything happen in it are some of the most vile people you would never ever want to be like. And they're the backbone to an establishment that feeds you the messages that are so toxic to the individual in our society. All right, so knowing what 9/11 was really about, it opens the door. And you go down the rabbit hole, but there's a light at the end, because this makes you instantly reject these messages fed to you, because your mind is able to bounce them off. All right, it's able to repel them. It's like having your brain coated with steel. In my case, steel with an extra E at the end. So wake up, speak out, and help out. Okay, that's ae911truths.org. Go there right now. Okay, before we get to our guests, we're going to do what we do most weeks. We're going to take about 10 seconds of silence to remember the victims of 9/11 and their families, and all the people who have died in the wars that followed 9/11. So we're going to do that right now. And that is 10 seconds. Our guest today is Adam Taylor. Adam has been an activist and researcher in 9/11 Truth since 2007, and he is a contributor to the site Debunking the Debunkers. That's at 911debunkers.blogspot.com. He's also a volunteer writer and researcher for Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, and we had him on last September to talk about his series of articles debunking popular mechanics, which is always fun to do. His YouTube channel is Citizen for 9/11 Truth. Adam, welcome back to 9/11 Freefall.
Hey, Andy. Thanks for having me back.
Well, I appreciate you coming on. Now, for most people who are being introduced to you for the first time, I know you've been on before and you covered this on a previous show, but tell us briefly again about yourself. What drew you into the world of 9/11 truth activism?
Well, I first got interested in researching the events of 9/11 after I watched a documentary about it on the History Channel in 2007. Talked about a lot of alternative theories regarding 9/11, and it just sparked my interest, and I decided I needed to look into this more because it seemed really important and was affecting pretty much the whole world. So next few months I just was looking through as many 9/11 websites as I could, watched some good documentaries, and decided this is what I need to do, what I need to research, and help get to the bottom of what happened that day.
And you've been very prolific, and your name I see pop up many places, so good job to you and for spreading the truth and getting it out there and taking on topics like these. And this is an important topic, and I know I've got my own opinions and reasons for why your newest paper is so important, but I'm going to let you tell the audience why you think it's important and why you tackled it. And this is taking on other collapses of other buildings, or partial collapses, or not even buildings, but these things that get thrown up when you cite that there's never been a complete collapse of a building like Building 7 from fire before, or a complete collapse of a steel frame high-rise, I should say, from fire before. So these examples get thrown up, but they're not exactly the same thing. So that's what your latest paper is about. Can you talk about it a little further and just start? We're going to go through each of these examples you give in the paper, but just an overview. Can you talk about that and why you felt the need to write this paper?
Right. The title of the paper is Other Collapses in Perspective, an examination of steel structures collapsing due to fire and their relation to the World Trade Center. It's published at the website scientificmethod911.org, which is a relatively new site that was started. And this paper is one that I actually originally wrote back in 2011 because it came at a time when I just kept hearing this one kind of irritating argument from debunkers and other official story supporters Because one argument that we in the truth movement often use is that if the official story were true, the Twin Towers in Building 7 would be the first steel-framed high-rise skyscrapers in history to collapse from fire. And that is true. You can look all over and look at other skyscrapers that have had large fires. None of them before or after 9/11 have ever collapsed. Now, to counter this, debunkers try to say, well, there are maybe other skyscrapers haven't collapsed, but there are other smaller steel structures that have collapsed in fire. And to them, this validates the idea that fire could have caused the Twin Towers and Building 7 to collapse. Yeah, and I heard this argument so much, and people kept throwing it to me, and from the start I could see it was very fallacious, because these structures they reference, of course, are not skyscrapers. Some of them aren't even buildings. They're just steel structures. And it was just irritating hearing this over and over and over again. So I decided, you know what, I should write something explaining in detail why these other structures are not justifiable comparisons to the towers in Building 7, just so that if someone tries using this argument against me at some point, I can just link them to my paper, and they can go read that. Or if anybody else has this argument thrown at them, they can just reference my paper and kind of be done with it. Today, or in 2013, when the website scientificmethod911.org was started, they said they were accepting papers for publication, and I saw they didn't have any papers on the World Trade Center issue yet. So I thought, well, I have this paper. I've had it online just for people to see on the Debunkers blog for a while. So I figured, okay, I'll just submit that to there so this gets out to more people and they can read it. And I submitted it. The moderators there, they really liked it. Had a few suggestions for me to update it, which I did, and now it's published there in its current form. And I've added a lot of stuff to it from when I first put it online, and I think I make a slam dunk case, but that's for the readers to decide, and I highly encourage people to go read it and decide for themselves.
And this is an important resource that you've contributed, because I've had people throw some of these structures at me before, and if you've never heard of them before, then you kind of you step back and you take a look, and then you see a building that maybe had like a partial, a few floors collapse, and it still left most of like a burnt out skeleton, and the circumstances of the fire were completely different. And then you look at World Trade Center Building 7, and you come back to whoever cited it, and the only thing you can say to them is, are you kidding me? And it would almost be funny that these people cite these things, if not for the seriousness of the situation and the tragedy of it. It's absolutely ridiculous, some of these things. I mean, one of them is even a road, but we're going to get to all of them today. So I don't want to give away too much here in the beginning. But that is an important resource, and it's something that people should read, because it's not a long paper. It's not like a 200-page volume or anything like that. It's like roughly I'd say about 20 pages, if memory serves me right. And you read about these buildings, you see the pictures of them, and you put them in your mind, and you'll remember these structures for later debates. You can cite them in your mind and be able to rattle off all the facts about it. Without even having to go back to the paper, if you study it well enough and you study up. So I'm going to have a link up at 911freefall.com for everybody to instantly access it and save it to your hard drives, have it up on your own 9/11 Truth blogs as well. Okay, so what we're going to do, we're going to go through each of these examples that you list, and we're going to go over some of these facts. We're going to have you, Adam, give the circumstances of these structures that are cited in the paper, tell people about them, and I'm going to ask the viewer at home to go to the archive and get the paper up, because it's one thing to listen to us, but seeing is believing too. So go to 911freefall.com. It is up there right now. Okay, the first building that we're looking at here is the Windsor Tower. Now, Adam, go ahead and tell us about the Windsor Tower.
Yeah, this was a about 30-story skyscraper in Madrid, Spain. And in 2005, it suffered a very massive fire, one that lasted over 20 hours. And this one is often cited by debunkers because the upper part of it did collapse. Some of its steel supports did collapse from the fire. But there's important distinctions to make about it. Now, this building and another one that I talked about have been addressed before by other people, such as at the website 911research.com. But I do briefly mention it here because this is an example of a structure that is collapsing, but it's doing so it's in a very progressive way. It's falling apart over time. The collapse events happen over the several hours that it was burning, where you have parts of the building falling off at different points. It's being gradually weakened. And I actually like this building a lot because I think it's a perfect example of how a skyscraper should collapse if fire is actually causing it. Now again, this wasn't a total collapse. The overall structure did remain standing. But you see, in the case of this building, when the fire is causing parts of it to fall off, it's happening over a long period of time. It's not instantaneous, as in the case of the towers in Building 7. And it's a massive fire that lasts for a very long time, unlike the fires for the Twin Towers in Building 7. The Twin Towers burned for 56 and 102 minutes, I believe, respectively. And Building 7, according to NIST, only burned somewhere between 3.5 and 4 hours. But with this building, the majority of it stands up. It collapses, parts of it collapse over a long period of time, and most of it stays up. And that's exactly the kind of thing that I would expect to see if fire is causing this kind of damage to a building. So I don't see this as being particularly a good comparison to the Twin Towers in Building 7, because everything about it's different from how fire supposedly affected the towers and World Trade Center 7.
Right, and I just want to add, too, that when this thing lit up, this thing was like a torch in the night. I mean, there was fire shooting out of just every part of it, which is unlike World Trade Center 7, where, there was fire inside it, but if you actually looked at it from the street, you wouldn't see flames just shooting out of it like a torch. I use that description as perfectly accurate, and you have a picture here of the aftermath. You still have a lot of the buildings still standing up, and even on one side, there's a part of it that where, there's half the building still standing as you get to the top, almost like a giant monster or something took a bite out of it. All right, and you're absolutely right. That is exactly what a steel frame high-rise should look like when it collapses because of fire. It's not something where the whole thing just all the supports give way at once and it falls down controlled demolition style. It should be a natural phenomenon. It should be a chaotic one. It should have no rhyme or reason to it, and that is exactly what you see in the outcome of the Windsor Tower building in the picture you have right here in the paper.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Now, the other one that you cite along with the Windsor Tower building is the McCormick Place, and before I give my own description of it, I'm going to have you describe to our audience the McCormick Place.
Right. The McCormick Place building was sort of this kind of warehouse structure, and it wasn't like a multi-story structure. It's open-spaced, and the collapse of it was caused by, the partial collapse, I should say. A fire broke out in the building, and this it's not even almost accurate to call this a building collapse. This was a roof collapse. The fire caused the roof of the structure to cave in. But again, this isn't something that should be particularly surprising, because as it's just a roof, it doesn't have the same kind of supports that you have in a multi-story superstructure like the towers in Building 7. Some people like to reference this structure because it had trusses that were similar to the towers, but you have to keep in mind that these trusses in this building failed, but the floor trusses in the Twin Towers, according to NIST, they didn't fail. It's because they didn't fail that supposedly caused the towers to collapse, but caused the inward bowing phenomenon. But we can see from the McCormick Place, the trusses behave in a way that not even NIST says that the trusses in the towers behave. So citing this as a comparison is just really faulty because it doesn't even behave the same way the towers are supposed to have behaved according to the official investigators. And again, it's not a total collapse. It's just a roof collapse. Most of the structure still stayed up. It's not surprising if a roof caves in because it doesn't have the same kind of inner support as the Twin Towers in Building 7 would have had.
Right, and I'm looking at the picture here, and to give a description to the audience, it almost looks from this aerial view like a rectangular birthday cake where something goes wrong in the oven and the middle sinks in. And now you're being very nice by how you describe people who are citing this as comparable to the World Trade Center Twin Towers or Building 7. I think it's absolutely idiotic to do that. I mean, what you're looking at is a roof collapse. It's not even, it looks like a rectangular birthday cake that had the middle sink in to it. It's absolutely nothing like the Twin Towers or Building 7. Anyone with two eyes and common sense can see that. The next one that you cite here is the Sight and Sound Theater that from January of 1997. Can you describe that, Adam?
Yeah. This was a theater in Pennsylvania that suffered a collapse from a fire that lasted about 3.5 hours. Now, this building was a rectangular-shaped structure, and it was approximately 100 feet wide and 74 feet tall. The fire in this building, like the McCormick Place, again, this caused a roof collapse because this was an open-spaced type structure that wasn't multi-story. And the fires in here only caused the roof to cave in. So again, this is something that you could, I'd say at most, call a roof collapse. It's not a building collapse because the overall structure appears to be standing, and I show pictures of that in my paper. And other issues, too, that I cite that were cited by other investigators, including that this building had no sprinkler system, construction caused damage to the fire-resistant coating on it, and it was under construction at the time, so its fire doors weren't installed yet, which allowed the fires to pass through it a lot easier. But again, it's not a skyscraper that suffered a supposed progressive collapse that the towers are supposed to have exhibited. So I don't see this as being very comparable either because it's just, again, at most a roof collapse. I wouldn't even call it a building collapse technically because most of the building still looks like it's there.
Right, and I'm looking at the pictures right now. These are black and white photos, and folks, when he says it's not a high-rise, I mean, he's not kidding. This almost looks like a church or some kind of like old meeting hall from colonial days in New England or something like that. In fact, I'm not sure where this was located, this building. I believe it was in Pennsylvania, so it's in the Northeast. But that's what it looks like. It looks absolutely nothing like the Twin Towers or World Trade Center 7. And again, this is one of those that anybody that's citing this building, which is, again, what you said, is just a roof collapse and the building was under construction. Anyway, anyone who would want to compare this to what you saw in New York on September 11th is really fetching. And I mean, they're fetching to the point of, again, I don't want to use the word too much, but idiocy. This is nothing like it, and you can see that in the pictures here. And that's what people need to look like. So, I mean, it's not even a high-rise. Okay, we have next from May of 1993, the Cater Toy Factory. Go ahead and describe that.
Yeah. The Cater Toy Factory is actually a favorite of debunkers they like to cite because even though this also is not a skyscraper, it is a multi-story structure. And it collapsed from a pretty severe fire. And they like to cite this one because it's just fire alone. There's no damage or anything. But the official reports on this collapse show that this was a very badly built factory. It used weak steel, which none of which was insulated. It didn't have any sprinklers in it, and also it was apparently damaged by a series of smaller fires in the past. In fact, at the time of the fire that caused it to collapse, parts of the building were still being repaired from a fire that occurred only, I think, a month earlier, or a few months earlier. So this structure I find extremely bad comparison, because this is by all accounts, a badly built building that had issues of fire before. I'm not particularly surprised it collapsed, and people trying to compare this to the Twin Towers, which were very well built. Again, these were buildings built to withstand the impact of an airplane, which they should have on 9/11. And here you have a building that is made from weak steel, has no sprinklers, no fire insulation. It's just a very bad comparison, and I think people trying to compare it to the towers in Building 7 are really reaching.
Well, they're reaching, and I got a question now. I don't know if you know this. Is this building just because it wasn't even the full factory? It was just this E-shaped area that connected a couple of buildings in the factory that collapsed. Did it fall down in segments, or did it come down all at the same time?
That I'm not too sure of, because we don't have any video of this collapse. But I imagine it probably did come down in sections, that probably one part of it fell, another part may have fallen with it quickly. But, and that actually is something some debunkers like to do. It's one structure, but they sort of like to reference it as three, because they say it's just three structures connected. But even so, like I said, the conditions of this particular incident are just totally not the same as what we saw on September 11th. So it's overall just a bad comparison.
Right, and you can't compare the World Trade Center towers, which were, a lot of care and effort went into creating them from a very wealthy country that we were, in creating these iconic buildings. I haven't been to Thailand, I've been to China, though. I've seen some of the factories that were there, and they are nothing like our buildings here in the United States. So again, just like you say, anybody that's citing this thing is reaching, and when they say it's multi-stories, it's nowhere close to the kind of multi-stories that you saw with the World Trade Center towers in Building 7. Again, this was just some factory in Thailand. It wasn't a giant high-rise like you see in New York. Now, we also have the Mumbai High North Platform. What is that?
Well, this is another structure that is not a skyscraper, and it's not even a building. This was an oil platform that collapsed in July of 2005 because a support vessel crashed into it and caused a huge fire, and the platform collapsed after about 2 hours of burning. Now, the reason that this one I find isn't comparable, let's even ignore the fact that it's not even a building. Let's just focus on the fact that it is a steel structure. But this structure, according to the official reports on it, the platform produced about 80,000 barrels of oil per day, which is over 3 million gallons. So you had over 3 million, let's just say, to be generous, you had 3 million gallons of oil burning to fuel the fire, and it's out in the open too, so you've got an unlimited supply of air fueling it also, which is totally not comparable to the Twin Towers, which at most had less than 10,000 gallons of jet fuel in it and regular office furniture. And in the case of Building 7, only office furniture. And these were normal fires in Building 7, supposedly, that caused it to collapse. So with this platform, you've got an unlimited supply of fuel and oil, just causing the fire to become severe. It's not surprising this structure came down. anything that might collapse if you've got that much fuel behind it. with the towers in Building 7, you had nowhere near the same kind of fuel that this would have had to cause collapse. So this seems like a completely unjustified comparison when you look at the details.
Right, and you talk about the jet fuel later on in the paper when you go into the World Trade Center destructions, and kind of describe what the damage was, just so people understand. And we'll get into that a little bit more later on in the show if we have time. But this is absolutely different. You have an endless supply of fuel here, whereas with the World Trade Center towers, people are impressed by the big massive fireball shooting out of the building when the planes hit it, but the fact is that means a lot of the jet fuel was spent in that massive fireball. So you had nowhere near the amount of fire, or amount of fuel for fire, I should say, in the World Trade Center towers as you did with this oil platform that caught on fire in 2005. And you cite somebody who stated that the amount of jet fuel in the trade centers could have been fit into a Ryder truck, correct, in your paper?
That's right. Yeah, the amount of fuel that would have remained in the towers would have fit into the back of a mid-sized U-Haul truck. That's how much fuel we're talking about. Imagine, a little U-Haul truck compared to the 110 stories of one of the towers. It's just puny in comparison.
Now, this one's funny. I remember this next one coming out back in 2007, and this was around that period where I was still in a research phase, but this really set me back when they cited this as comparable to the World Trade Center destructions, just by how ridiculous the argument is. This is Interstate 580 in Oakland, California, when it collapsed by a fire started by a gas tanker. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. This is one that I think debunkers really like to reference, because this is a case where a steel structure collapsed in about 20 minutes after the fire was burning. But it shouldn't even have to be explained fully why this is a bad comparison, because this is not a skyscraper, it's definitely not a building, it's a road. And there's so many reasons why this is just a horrible comparison to the towers in Building 7. For starters, this is an open-air fire where it can reach higher temperatures, similar to the previously mentioned platform. This is out in the open where the air can fuel it freely, whereas with the fires in the towers in Building 7, they wouldn't have had access to as much oxygen. And also with this road, the fires are focused on one section of the structure. The fires are focused on this one part of the road that eventually did collapse, whereas the fires in the towers in Building 7 were constantly moving around and going to different parts of it, which would let weakened sections of the buildings regain their strength once the fires burn themselves out or start to move to different parts. Also, this structure, for as hot as it was, did not leave any molten metal. In fact, none of the structures, as far as I know, left molten metal after they collapsed, unlike, again, the towers in Building 7. Also, an interesting thing about this collapse is it actually not only isn't good for the idea that fire could cause the structures to collapse, but also it greatly contradicts the idea of the so-called global pancake collapse that people think happened in the case of the towers, because when the road collapsed onto the road below it, it didn't cause the lower road to collapse. So this contradicts the idea that you could have a pancake collapse in the case of the towers, because they would have been very strongly secure and suggested that the collapse could have been arrested, as was the case for this road. And also, in the case of this road, even though the road itself collapsed, the columns that held it up were still standing, unlike the towers in Building 7, where all of their support columns collapsed with the structures.
Right, and that's an important point. I didn't mean to interrupt, but that's an important point. And we know the pancake collapse was thrown out and I'm saying this to the audience, we know that it was thrown out, but people still cite it because they don't really have any idea what the official story is of the trade towers. So, I mean, this debunks people's preconceptions about what they think the official story is, even though it's not anymore because it keeps changing. Please go on.
Right. Also, when I looked at the official report on this collapse, they examined the steel and found that the steel was heated to temperatures of roughly 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit to as high as 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. But in the case of the towers, we know that when NIST examined the steel, they found no evidence that any of the steel from the towers had reached temperatures above around 1,100 degrees Fahrenheit. And in fact, the highest temperature they did estimate for the steel was about 480 degrees Fahrenheit. So we know from just looking at all the steel that steel from this road was heated to higher temperatures, in fact, much higher temperatures than the steel from the towers. So again, every point you look at it, from how it collapsed to how the steel was affected, it's just not a good comparison to the Twin Towers or Building 7.
Right, and anybody that cites this road collapse as some kind of debunking of 9/11 truth really ought to go hide under a rock and be ashamed of themselves. I'd be embarrassed even if I was on the other side to cite this. And you make a very important point about the fires. Now, first of all, the fires that this road was subjected to were hotter than the World Trade Center towers, but you don't have any molten steel at this site. That's because the fuel doesn't get hot enough to melt the steel. You also have the fact, like you said, that it was concentrated in one area, whereas in the World Trade Center 7, it was not. It got scattered. It moved around, and that's a really important point, because if World Trade Center 7 had a section collapse and then maybe another section collapse, but left a large part of it, well, then you would say, okay, fire did that. And there's other examples of buildings in the World Trade Center complex that we don't talk about because they had partial collapses. They fell in a way that goes along with a fire. They make sense, so we don't ever talk about them. We talk about these three buildings that don't make sense because, again, for World Trade Center 7 to make sense, every support would have to have given away pretty much at once for this building to fall the way that it did. And I challenge anybody to find any steel frame high-rise that's ever fallen in the way World Trade Center 7 did, in a controlled demolition style because of fire. But certainly it is not the same thing as a road. Again, anybody that cites this road as some kind of refutation of 9/11 truth really ought to be embarrassed. Now, I talked about, other buildings in the World Trade Center complex that caught fire and maybe had partial collapses and still left pieces of themselves up. One example of that is World Trade Center 5. Can you talk about World Trade Center 5?
Yeah. Building 5 had some pretty severe fires in it as well on 9/11, and it suffered a partial collapse after it was damaged from falling debris from the collapse of the towers. This debris caused structural damage and started fires in the building. And according to official reports, this had a local collapse of 4 floors inside the building, which they say was caused by the fires. Now, again, people like to cite this because they think it adds validity to the concept of a pancake-type collapse. But there's a lot of things to keep in mind about this structure. One is that its connections were much different than the connections in the towers of Building 7. This used a web truss, or let me see there. They used what are known as shear stubs for floors 4 through 8, which were the floors that collapsed. But when you look at other floor connections on other floors in the building, floor 9 was more of a traditional setup, and it was heated just as much as the other floors from the temperatures from the lower floors, but the steel on that floor only sagged. It didn't collapse. And in the case of the connections that did fail, you can see, and I cite these pictures in my paper, you can see that the shear tabs that connected these columns, they didn't even fail from the fires. It's only where you actually had the shear stubs connected to each other to the columns that they failed. But the actual tabs they were connected to, they stayed put because they were more firmly connected to the steel. So I would say that this collapse, this partial collapse, rather, is not comparable because you've got a case where it's just weaker type of connections in the building than would have existed in the towers in Building 7. And not only that, but the fourth floor in this building actually didn't collapse, even though it had floors 8 through 5 collapse onto it. And the reason that didn't collapse is because the third floor wasn't on fire, meaning that it had no heat below to weaken the fourth floor. So the fourth floor was very strong because it hadn't been weakened yet. So the fact that it wasn't weakened by fire means it could resist these upper floors collapsing on top of it. This is a major problem for people who say fire could have caused Building 7 to collapse. And we're told that this building collapsed because floor 13 collapsed down to the 5th floor. But you only had in this building no more than 3 floors on fire, one above the other, at any given time, which means that you had floors that weren't being weakened from heat below that should have been able to resist the floors collapsing on top of it, because this building used much stronger supports and connections than would have existed in Building 5. So I don't see this as a good comparison, even though this one is often used. In fact, it was actually used in the BBC documentary trying to debunk theories surrounding Building 7. But as I demonstrate in my paper, it's a bad comparison because they're just structures that aren't constructed the same way.
Well, yeah, and you look at this building, too, and again, there's no way you can compare this to Building 7, because, first of all, this was a partial collapse. That means there's still a portion of the building you can walk into afterwards. You wouldn't want to walk into it. It'd be very dangerous, but it's still there. And you look at this picture you have of this building, this looks nothing like Building 7 before it fell, because in this picture of the structure, you see more pink and yellow and orange of fire than you do of building. That's because it burns out and it burns away a lot of the building, but it leaves the steel skeleton. That is what World Trade Center 7 should have looked like if any part of it actually had fallen because of fire. Now, our next building is the Dogwood Elementary School. Can you talk about this?
Yeah, this is a building that collapsed in November of 2000 after a fire broke out in it. And one reason this is often cited, not only is it a steel-structured building, but also it collapsed in about half an hour. So debunkers and other critics like to cite this because it shows steel failing in a relatively short amount of time. But I point out several issues about this building that explains why it collapsed from the fire. For starters, it wasn't subject to current fire code regulations because of when it was built, whereas the towers in Building 7, I believe, did meet all the regulations that they would have had to meet when they were built. And other issues regarding it is that this building did not have working sprinklers in it to fight the fires, and also what contributed to the massive size of these fires is that it had no firewalls to stop the spread of the fires. So again, you've got a structure here that's nowhere near as well built as the towers of Building 7, and it's being subjected to very intense fires that the building has no way to fight off the fires itself. So the fact that it collapsed, again, not very surprising to me. This is not a multi-story structure. It's an elementary school. So how you could compare an elementary school to massive steel skyscrapers that, again, were built to take the impact of airplanes. There's not many elementary schools that are built to withstand, a jumbo jet hitting it. So this is a really bad comparison if you try to use this.
You're right, and I look at this, and you got pictures of the aftermath, but this was a single-story building in some rinky-dink town in Virginia, no disrespect intended for the residents of it. It's nothing like the World Trade Center towers or Building 7. And again, like you say, we can conclude that comparing the structure of the Twin Towers and Building 7 is unjustifiable. Again, it's embarrassing for anybody that wants to cite this because it is nothing like what we saw in New York. Now, the next one, I find this kind of ironic. It's the Faculty of Architecture building that suffered a partial collapse in 2008. I guess it's just kind of ironic that it's the Faculty of Architecture building who says that nature doesn't have a sense of humor sometimes. Can you talk about this?
Yeah. This incident happened in May of 2008, and it started on the 6th floor of this 13-story structure, and it burned for a little over 7 hours, and eventually a section of the building collapsed from the fires. And I would actually say that out of all the structures that I talk about in my paper, this is the one that is probably the most comparable to at least the Twin Towers, because this collapse started on the 10th floor, and it did progress down to the bottom. And a lot of people like to say that this is comparable to the towers, as you have a top-down kind of progressive collapse that we see happening. But there's a lot of things you have to keep in mind. For starters, in terms of the severity of the fires, this structure burned much longer than the Twin Towers, and really burned probably longer than Building 7. The fires in Building 7 started and burned for about 7 hours, but the NIST report says that the critical fires that caused collapse only lasted between 3.5 and 4 hours. But even that aside, you have the issue of, again, this is a partial collapse. The whole structure did not collapse. Only one section of it did. Most of the structure did remain standing. And then you also have the issue of it's a building that's built a lot differently than the towers. It used sort of more concrete-type columns, and from reports I've read, it seems that the heat from the fires caused spallation of the concrete, which initiated the collapse. And not only that, but this collapse, I think, is another indication that what we would have seen on 9/11, had fire actually been the cause of collapse, the fires would have caused a much different event than what we actually did see. Because unlike a lot of the other structures I talk about in my paper, we do have a few videos of this collapse occurring. And when you time the collapse, you see that from top to bottom, for the 13 stories to collapse, it takes about 10 seconds. Now, the Twin Towers collapsed in around 13 to 15 seconds. But these are 110-story structures. And in the case of this architecture building, it's only 13 stories. So you have a 13-story structure taking about 10 seconds to collapse, whereas with towers, you have 110 stories collapsing in at most 15 seconds. And with Building 7, it's a 47-story structure collapsing in less than 7 seconds. So if these buildings, if the towers in Building 7 were really collapsing from fire, they should be taking a lot longer than the times we saw if this Faculty of Architecture building is any indication. So I don't...
Right, and then, I don't mean to interrupt, but any debunker citing this is actually debunking themselves from what you're pointing out right here.
Yeah, exactly. I think this structure is really bad for them to cite because they're kind of shooting themselves in the foot with it, because it just contradicts the circumstances of the tower collapses in just so many significant ways.
Amazing. Now, in our last few minutes here, because you have a section called The Twin Towers and World Trade Center 7 in Perspective, you talk about some of the factors involved in the building destruction, things people just throw up saying, oh, well, that jet fuel, and they were hit by airplanes, what else do you want? Can you talk about that briefly? What real impact did these factors have in the destructions of these buildings?
Yeah, the first thing I talk about is the jet fuel, because people like to say that's a major difference from the towers and other skyscraper fires, that those other buildings didn't have jet fuel in them. But when you actually measure the amount of jet fuel that would have stayed in the towers, it, again, would have fit into the back of a U-Haul truck or an above-ground swimming pool. So, again, I want to make it clear, the jet fuel is not what primarily fueled the fire, but it definitely started the fire and helped ignite them. But it's a very much smaller amount than I think most people are aware. In fact, it's roughly only about 3,000 gallons in either building. So it's not the full 10,000 gallons that would have been in planes when they first impacted. Now, in the case of the actual damage that the planes caused, because people like to cite that too, that the towers would have had structural damage, I cite literature showing that the damage parameters that NIST estimated are probably lower than what they say, that the damage probably wasn't as severe as NIST is claiming. And in fact, NIST says, in regards to what the impacts themselves did, what was really harmful to the structures was the fact that the fireproofing was supposedly blown off, that the impacts caused widely dislodged fireproofing. This report itself says that if fireproofing had not been widely dislodged, the towers likely would have remained standing. And I cite several reasons why the fireproofing could not have been widely dislodged. The first thing I point out is that with the North Tower, you have the plane impacting on the side opposite to where the collapse itself starts, where the fires would have been. The plane, as it enters the building, is going to lose a lot of kinetic energy, and how it's supposed to knock off the fireproofing all the way on the other side where the collapse starts doesn't seem very likely. The other reason I cite is that in this scenario, to widely dislodge the fireproofing, it involves the planes shredding themselves into these very small, kind of bullet-sized pieces, so that the debris spread out more and it's wiping the fireproofing off. But we know from the testimony of at least one eyewitness who escaped the South Tower, he says that he actually saw intact portions of the plane. In fact, he said the wing was wedged in his office doorway. So if he saw intact portions of the plane in the building, it's likely that the planes were not shredded into these tiny pieces. They were probably more realistically shredded into large chunks that would have just clattered around inside the framework of the towers. And in fact, I also point out that Purdue University's simulation of Flight 11's impact into the North Tower shows exactly that. The plane doesn't shred itself into these tiny pieces that NIST says. It's breaking up into large chunks that just fly around inside the structure. But the biggest thing I also point out is that when you look at NIST estimates of where the fireproofing occurs, and people can look this up, I talk about this on page 23 of my paper. People can go directly to it. They estimated fireproofing loss for each floor, but if you look at the area of where the maximum inward blowing is happening, which is what they say initiated the collapse and what the fire is causing, you can see that in this very area where this blowing is happening, NIST estimates that there's no fireproofing loss in that part of the building. And again, they say if the fireproofing hadn't been widely dislodged, the towers would have stayed up. But their own estimates show that there was no fireproofing loss in the section that they're concluding the collapse started. So they just flatly contradict themselves here. and indicates that something else other than fires has to be causing the inward burn to happen. So in the case of the towers, I'd say that the jet fuel and structural damage are fairly moot when it comes to this, when it comes to these other structures that I talk about. And we know that in the case of Building 7, this claims that only normal office fires is what initiated the collapse, and that any of the structural damage that it sustained from the collapse of the North Tower didn't help to initiate the collapse. So these are parameters that need to be taken into account. They need to be examined, but I show that they're not great indicators that buildings should have collapsed. These buildings should not have collapsed from the fires and damage we saw on 9/11. They should have stayed up.
You're absolutely right. This is an important episode to have, and this is one of those points that needs to be addressed, and I'm glad you wrote that paper, and I'm glad that we actually took the time to go through all of these examples and to wrap it up the way we did. Basically the same as you did in your paper, because people need to hear this, and they need to have this laid out for them. Your average person doesn't think about this so in depth. They don't actually explore these different examples like you did here. And again, folks, you got to read the paper, because again, seeing is believing. I'm going to have a copy of that up at 911freefall.com, and you got to go and check out Debunking, the Debunkers website that Adam Taylor writes for. He's a very prolific writer, and you need to know this guy and keep updated on his new work. Adam, I want to thank you for coming on 9/11 Freefall. We are now out of time. Remember, folks, you can listen to this program every Thursday night at 10 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock Pacific on No Lies Radio. This is Andy Steele saying have a great week and good luck.